Hi, my name is Jude Blanchette. I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS. Thank you for joining us for this discussion of Suisheng Zhao's new book, The Dragon Roars Back, Transformational Leaders and Dynamics of Chinese Foreign Policy. I'm sure everyone tuning in knows Suisheng, has been reading his really path-breaking and influential work on Chinese domestic politics, Chinese foreign policy. Suisheng has been a careful and objective analyst of a rapidly changing China for several decades, and we're really delighted to discuss this very important but also well-timed book, which is, I think, going to be a real critical piece to understanding where China's foreign policy is going to be going over the next 5-10 years, in part by looking back at how China's foreign policy has transformed since the days of Mao Zedong up through the present with Xi Jinping. We're here for the next 29-ish minutes, and after a conversation between Suisheng and myself, we'd like to incorporate in some questions from the audience. So if you go to the CSIS webpage, go to the events page for this event, there is a link to submit questions. We welcome those submitted at any time, and I will do my very best to incorporate those into the discussion. So without further ado, Suisheng, thank you for joining us, and congratulations on the publication of the book.
Thank you for having me. This is a really great honor and pleasure to be here.
So I thought I'd start by asking the standard question you ask when someone just published a book, which is, why this book? What was the motivation for this? What was the puzzle that you were looking to explore?
I've been teaching Chinese foreign policy for how many decades? However, I have not seen a single book that covers the whole period of the PRC in about 70 years. And those books which have published on Chinese foreign policies are either on a certain period or on certain issue areas, not cover a whole bunch of different issues, integrate them into a framework, and also put in a whole historical context of the last 70 years. And a lot of books also have very single-dimensional explanations of the Chinese foreign policy and failed to see the transformation and to find what are the forces. Or even talking about forces, they talk about single issues driver, not in a very comprehensive and integrated way. So that's how I started thinking of writing a book which is historically comprehensive and conceptually coherent and up to date. To understand the transformation of the Chinese foreign policy and what are the primary sources or drivers that have put China in today's position as a so-called great power and try to change the international order or try to find its so-called rightful place in the world. So that's how I began to write the book eventually, and the pandemic helped me. 3 years really gave me a lot of time to think and write, to complete.
I wonder if I could ask you to lay out the main argument or arguments of the book. I actually wonder if I could start with just the title. We're in this period now where most books and articles about China are talking about the rapid decline of China. So I'm interested in how you came about the title of this dragon roaring back. It seems counterintuitive for a period where we seem to be seeing China stumble all over itself. I'm sure you have a different time horizon in mind when you talk about this dragon roaring back, but I wonder if you could just explain the argument behind the title.
This is a very interesting point because talking about China tumbling and China rise has come to the scene only, I think, in that's last year also. Before last year, the prevailing views were China was rising, China is coming back, and China was going to replace the U.S. in the 2025 or 2030. And the book, when I wrote the book, was just on that kind of context. People still thought China was rising, and even some people even thought China's rise was stoppable. Now we see maybe it could be stopped, but at that point it was stoppable. So the questions became, where does China go from there? And what are the forces driving China's so-called rise? And most studies from those periods look at China's rising power, so-called relative power. China's power in relations with the U.S. and other power has changed. In fact, changed to the China favor. And because of the power balance change, China's behavior has changed. China becomes more expansive or aggressive, and China redefined its national interests because of the power balance change. So, when I look at that argument, which has been very, very popular, I found it's right. So-called structural realist argument. But I don't think that tells the whole story. Because you look at back the 70 years of the PRC history. When Mao Zedong founded the PRC, China was a revolutionary power. It's very aggressive. China fought wars with both superpowers, with the U.S. and the Soviet Union, confronted two superpowers simultaneously, and supported the Third World revolutionary forces. But China's relative power was very weak at that time. So in that context, you really cannot explain China's behavior using the relative power argument. And Deng Xiaoping came to power and started economic reform and opened up. And China became much more moderate and reconciliatory. And during that time, China's power position did not change that much either. In fact, later on, in the late period, Deng Xiaoping's period, when Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao came to power, China was rising. China's power relatively rising in relationship with many other countries, including their neighbors. But China did not change to more aggressive behavior. Hu Jintao even talked about the peaceful rise. In fact, during those periods, when scholars in the U.S. and other parts of the world talk China as a rising power, they try to deny that. China said they are a developing country, and they are not a big power. China will never seek a superpower position. But China power was rising. But China behavior was not driven yet by the relative power. So in that context, this argument was not sufficient either. Now Xi Jinping came to power, and China power is rising. And China behavior continued changed again. But as you said, in the last couple of years, China is stumbling. I don't know if that would stop Xi Jinping from pursuing his aggressive foreign policy. So in that context, I think the relative power argument would not be sufficient. Other than that, there are some other arguments. Another argument scholarly use is called regime type, talking about democracy is peaceful, and authoritarian government is by nature aggressive. So it doesn't matter who is in power. If you don't change the regime, their foreign policy behavior will not be changed. But we don't see that either. I mean, China has always been authoritarian in the 70 years, but we also see the change in Chinese foreign policy behavior. And some other explanations, I say dimensional, unidimensional, bureaucratic politics, for example, argument talking about military versus civilian, all those, they cannot be used sufficiently to explain Chinese foreign policy behavior. Or you can use strategic culture type of argument, but those are not sufficient. Each one, when you put in a place, it's very powerful, but you cannot tell the whole history. So in that context, I try to develop a framework centered on the leaders. I argue that leaders matter. Each leader in the PRC history each what I call transformational leader with new visions and also political wisdoms to survive the jungle of the domestic politics. And also they know how to take advantage of other instruments, as we talked about, ideology, nationalism, historical memory, and also political intuitions, and also try to be able to respond strategically to international variables such as power structure, relative power, and also international norms. These leaders are the game changers. What I look at are three leaders here: Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, and Xi Jinping. Each has a new vision for China. Mao Zedong thought China was the revolutionary period. And because of the existence of imperialism, revolution would take place. When revolution takes place, war is inevitable. So he becomes his vision. That vision drives him to be aggressive, confronting, fighting all those forces trying to stop China. And Deng Xiaoping changed this vision. He thought peace and development is the central themes of his time. And in that case, war could be avoided. Why would we try to prepare a war and try to fight? So we focus on domestic economic modernization and try to build good neighboring relationship with China's surrounding countries, and also, more important, to build a very constructive relationship with the United States, the key for China's modernization. So these visions, and Xi Jinping now has a totally different vision. He thought China time has come. China will restore to its ancient glorious great power position. All other countries have to subordinate to China's core national interests. You are either with us or against us. You are with us, you survive. If you are against us, you will be in trouble. So he has pursued that vision. And why these three leaders, they could be successful to pursue their visions? Because they survived the domestic political power struggle. And some other leaders, I look at some other leaders, Zhao Ziyang, Hua Guofeng, and Hu Yaobang. They also had new visions for China, but they failed. They were purged.
So can I ask, I want to drill down on this a little bit. You've laid out the insufficiency of some other explanatory frameworks for trying to understand Chinese foreign policy decision making. One of the debates here in Washington has been this idea that there's actually broad consistency in overarching goals and even some policies between the Hu period and the Xi Jinping period. So looking at China's efforts in the South China Sea, looking at this much more nationalist, aggressive foreign policy that many date back to the global financial crisis. I wonder if you could talk about why you think that Xi is a clear rupture from previous leaders. And do you see any broad consistency, though, among the post-Mao leadership, consistency of goals, consistency of means, or do you think there are radical demarcations between, I'm thinking specifically of the post-Mao era. Do you see clear demarcations between leaders, or what continuities do you see?
All Chinese leaders, they are nationalists, as you said. They have three overarching goals for China: security, power, and prosperity. But they have when they are in the different periods of the PRC, and the different each leader in their different socialization and in different political environment, they prioritize different part of those overarching goals. For Mao Zedong was security, definitely was security, survival of China. And Deng Xiaoping was prosperity. And Xi Jinping now is power. So we see all the three overarching goals, but they have a different priorities in a different period. And also they have a different approaches, different ways to realize those objectives. Mao Zedong was very confrontational, and because he thought revolution. He was a revolutionary leader. And the founding of PRC really gave him those confidence that this revolution is worldwide, cannot be stopped. And so he took a very revolutionary approach for the security. For the Chinese troops across Yalu River, for example, to fight wars with the U.S., it's so clear. He used the term to drive the wolves off the border. So it's not to expand China at that time, it's security of China. But it was very, very aggressive from the Western perspective. Weak Chinese army fighting the most advanced UN force that by the United States is very aggressive, but it's for China's survival, China's security. So that's the instrument. Deng Xiaoping, during his period, he for the survival issue was largely resolved, but still hanging on there when he started economic reform. But his goal was prosperity. He tried to make China rich. I think Xi Jinping today said, Mao made China stand up, and Deng Xiaoping made China rich. He is now making China strong. And so he tried to make China rich. And in order to do that, he had to avoid confrontations with neighbors and with the United States. In fact, as I said earlier, he thought every country had good relationship becomes rich. He took Li Zhenzhi in an airplane at that time. So he really believed in that. And so in that case, he tried to have good relationship with the United States and with European countries, and also build so-called good neighboring relationships with China surrounding, they call periphery countries. So it's different approach, but for this kind of overarching objective, Xi Jinping is totally different animal. He's now for power.
I wonder if you could talk a bit about the institutional architecture that gives leaders in authoritarian, or in this case specifically sort of China's Leninist system, so much authority. You talk about in the book that in democratic systems, leaders are more constrained by interest groups, by other parts of the U.S., of the government. In China, why is it that a leader is able to affect such a profound shift in foreign policy?
That's exactly the case. In a democratic systems, leaders come and gone, and bureaucracy is there. So very often they are constrained by the bureaucracy, and they have not many leeways to reconstruct the bureaucracy. But in the Chinese case, all three leaders I talked about, they have lifetime tenure. Xi Jinping now has also secured his third term. In fact, it's a lifetime tenure. So they are not those leaders come and gone. They have those kind of long-term vision. And according to those vision, they reconstruct the bureaucracy, the institutions. And Mao Zedong, during his time, for example, the bureaucracy, the foreign policy bureaucracy, was relatively small. He was hands-on on a lot of strategic issues. For example, to go to war in Korea, and to normalization of relationship with the United States. He's hands-on on those issues, and he could put them through easily. And in order also to do that, for these leaders, their issue is how to coordinate, in Chinese terms, to coordinate the bureaucracy to manage or to structure the bureaucracy to their policy advantage. And Mao Zedong started the so-called central leadership, central small leadership group system. He founded the China's Central Foreign Affairs Leadership Small Group 1958. And this leadership small group reported directly to the Politburo at that time. He said it's not government institution, it's a party institution, very clearly, for his personal use. But for the routine policy-making type, he had very trusted lieutenant, Zhou Enlai. Right. So he let him to handle those issues. But he was very clear, all the strategic issues, I have to make decision. And Zhou Enlai was also very clear on all those issues. Every decision, eventually, I will report to Mao Zedong. So that's the power structure. The leader is so powerful at just a matter of what he wanted to do. And Deng Xiaoping forced somehow different institutional environment because of the opening up, because of the increase in the interactions with the international community. There are increasing players coming to the increasingly crowded stage of foreign policy making. So he had to find a new way to coordinate. What he did was two things, I think, different from Mao Zedong in that case. One is decentralization. He decentralized policy making to let the more and more players to get involved. And the second is what my former advisor, Susan Shirk, a concept, delegation by consensus. He delegated decision-making, routine decision-making to bureaucrats. If they could reach consensus, then he ratified them. He intervened only if they cannot reach consensus. Here, another thing here is that since Deng Xiaoping and also his successors, Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, they also started so-called collective leadership and try to build consensus building. So for Deng Xiaoping, the way to build consensus is let more people to involved, let them to work out differences. Then the process could be long, but more rational and more predictable. So that was the way Xi Jinping totally changed the whole process. He re-centralized the power, the foreign policy making process, and re-strengthened the leadership small groups and built more leadership small groups to coordinate the policy making process. So he is in the top, very, very top.
As you were talking about the period leading up to Xi Jinping and Deng's effort to decentralize foreign policy making, I was thinking that one of the criticisms of Chinese policy making around the time that Xi Jinping came to power is that it was too decentralized. You saw this in security policy making, you saw this in foreign policy making, you saw this in party control of the military. There was a belief in 2010, 2011, 2012 that decentralization had gone too far and you didn't have effective policy making. So I'm curious, just as an initial question on the Xi period, do you see some rationale behind Xi's efforts to re-centralize, not from a sense of him just being power hungry, but from a diagnostic concern that policymaking had just become too decentralized and had lost its efficacy?
Exactly, that was the sentiments before Xi Jinping came to power, 九龙治水, and too many decentralization and too many bargaining among players and collective leadership make the decisions undecisive and corruption and rampant. And even the monopoly of the CCP power was threatened. All those kind of sentiments really gave Xi Jinping the opportunity to re-centralize the power.
And do you think this was a mandate he was handed to make these changes, or do you think this
He
is
took advantage of this.
Okay.
I will say that. But I thought that was the right direction China is supposed to go. And that will eventually bring the so-called authoritarian regime down. Mao Zedong was very kind of a real totalitarian. And when Deng Xiaoping started reform, Chinese authoritarian system gradually softened. Although still authoritarian, but softened and fragmented. And that direction, if China move continuously toward that direction, the about modernization theory would make sense. And China would eventually graduate from authoritarian, just like South Korea, Taiwan, and other countries. That's exactly a lot of so-called authentic communists. All those Chinese, those kind of leaders worried about Soviet Unions, the former Soviet Unions collapse, talked about. They said, how could China continue that direction? The Communist Party will lose power. That's our concern. And Xi Jinping took advantage of that concern and said, I'm the right person. I will save the Communist Party. I will re-centralize. I will prevent all those corruptions. I will stop all those kind of chaotic situation. Here we are. A real authoritarian state coming back. Even more authoritarian to a certain extent than Mao Zedong time. So we are moving toward the Cultural Revolution. We are moving to the starting time of a communist system. But that's exactly as you said. Xi Jinping took advantage of this type of chaotic situation. Transition, that's what people talk. The transition is always chaotic. So that's the problem Xi Jinping discovered and used and rebuilt his personal authority. Here, there are two triggers, I think, for Xi Jinping to re-centralize his party. First is what we talked about here, the chaotic situation, the weak leadership of Hu Jintao. At the Hu Jintao years, really everybody talked about weakness. But that's good for me as a political science scholar. That's a transition. But for him, that's collapse of the communist regime. So that's one aspect. Second is corruption. The corruption cases really appeared just in a week of the 18th Party's Congress. We saw Bo Xilai, we saw all those Lin Jihua, all those Zhou Yongkang, all those people. So that also gave him opportunity, using corruption cases to centralize his power in order to stop corruption. So he did a very good job, very smart. That's why I saw political wisdoms. You have to have a vision, and also you have to have political wisdom, skills.
As you're just talking, one of the things that I always think about is a lot of the analysis of China today makes it seem very inevitable that we ended up where we are today. And I was just writing a list of very specific people or events that if they hadn't had gone the way they went, I wonder where we would be now. So I'm thinking if Bo Xilai's wife hadn't killed Neil Haywood, that one cup of tea in a hotel in Chongqing, or if Wang Lijun had not gone to the consulate. The Arab Spring, right, which had a profound effect of instilling paranoia in the party. Edward Snowden, if he hadn't have gone to Hong Kong and divulged all the information about U.S. surveillance efforts, which really panicked Beijing and helped catalyze their own efforts to control technology and data. The global financial crisis. So if Lehman Brothers had been a better run firm and you hadn't have had these, highly leveraged mortgage-backed securities. So I mean, that's what's so interesting is how important contingency is in China's trajectory that you can imagine. I mean, especially if you just took away Bo Xilai, I do wonder, how different China would be.
Yeah, contingencies are very, very crucial for making history. But individual leaders to take advantage of those contingencies are more important.
Yeah.
Without Xi Jinping, we'll not see those artificial islands
Yeah.
built in South China Sea. I heard before Xi Jinping, those think tanks in China, they advised Hu Jintao many, many times. He should build those artificial islands. Hu Jintao never dared to do that. So no, we cannot do that. It will cause so many problems. We'll be surrounded by U.S. or by other countries. But Xi Jinping heard that idea. Great idea.
Yeah.
Let's do it. So you see a different leader.
Yeah.
Those are issues there. Those islands are there. Those contingencies are there. But leaders, without Xi Jinping, will not see one belt, one road, which has become such a signature of the Chinese foreign policy, which is a total disaster, I think. Now, as you said, when China's economy is tumbling, how can they sustain that? And now they have new initiatives such as the Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative. These are not totally different from One Belt, One Road. So without Xi Jinping, without leaders, we will not see all those things. Even though we see corruption case of Bo Xilai, we see Wang Lijun, we see all those cases, without Xi Jinping, we will not see this type of centralization. We will not see this type of politicized anti-corruption campaign. We will not see those military so-called big tigers to be purged the way he did. And he is the leader. That's what I said. Leadership, individual leaders in those historical changes are so important. So from that perspective, we can also argue that nothing is inevitable. History is not pretend. History is made by leaders. So Xi Jinping now is making history for China. Total disaster, in other words.
I want to come to that optimistic outlook at the end here, but I wanted to ask you a question on. We're talking about Xi Jinping as if he's some sort of fixed quantity. Curious how you think he has evolved over the last decade. Xi Jinping comes into power in the fall of 2012, talking about this China dream, rejuvenation, starts out very aggressively in 2013 with the Belt and Road Initiative, but also the third plenum, document on economic reform. How do you think Xi Jinping has evolved over the past 10 years? What do you think he's doing differently? Where do you think he's gotten better, and where do you think he's gotten worse?
When he came to office, I think he already planned about his vision of China. He proposed the China dream the first year he came to office. That is a very big idea for him, where China should go from there. But he was not as confident at that time. Then he proposed so-called the profound change unseen in century, this type of new concepts. Then proposed new type of international relations, all those a lot of new concepts. But during those period, China's power was still rising, and China, those kind of sentiments about his predecessors, 20 years, so-called chaotic, and now even now 20 years was very popular. So he gradually gained confidence, and he all those policies for at least the first 8 years were relatively successful until the pandemic. I think the pandemic is a turning point. He made one after another mistakes, and when China's economy now is going down road, and he can no longer afford all those policies. I think Sun Shirk's book, I agree with that argument. China overreached overplayed its hands. China, his confidence from that perspective is premature. And so from there on, I think all his mission now is to defend his mistakes. His mistakes he made in the last several years. He became increasingly defensive. Although his policy was still much more, at least from outside, is aggressive. But from the 20th Party's Congress speech report, you can see security. Now go back to security, Mao Zedong's time. Security, security, security. And security is everything. Economic development has been secondary. It's still, I mean, he tried to integrate security and development. But if these two are in conflict, security first. So he has met so many enemies, domestically and internationally. And from now on, I think his next 5 years, or you can say next 10 years, would be will focus more on defending his last 10 years of mistakes or accomplishments, whatever. So Xi Jinping, I think now China is in big trouble.
Can we unpack that a bit? So maybe I can ask you to apply that framework of Xi Jinping defending, maybe you could apply that to a few different issues. So one would be Taiwan. I was reading an article that you wrote recently articulating what you thought was going to be Beijing's strategy over the next several years. And I wonder if you could unpack how do you see cross-strait relations evolving. The question in DC, a lot of it is around Xi Jinping's intentions. I think we all know what Beijing's ultimate intention is, but really it's a question of timing, timelines, risk appetite, and what means China would use to compel unification. Look forward over the next 1, 2, 3, 5 years. How do you see Xi in his third term approaching cross-strait relations differently from his first and second terms?
Here, there are two issues I think for me are important. One is red line. What are the red lines he has drawn? Second is timetable. If there is a timetable, if there is, what is the timetable? I think these are two issues. I think there is clear sense in his mind. Red lines.
And can you talk about what you think some of the deep red lines are?
There are several of them. One is a 2005 anti-secession law. They draw 3 red lines, which in fact put forward for first time 2020 when Chen Shui-bian tried to push for those Gongtou referendum. One is Taiwan declare independence. Second is some instance that would cause Taiwan to leave China. Third is, that's a new one at that time. They talk about Taiwan would refuse reunification indefinitely. I mean, in other words, Taiwan's peaceful unification would be lost. So those are the 3 red lines in the so-called anti-secession law. And among the 3, only first is very clear. Taiwan declares independence. The other 2 are very vague. What are the...
But intentionally so to give Beijing options, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
at that time.
Yeah.
At that time. So that would depend on the interpretations afterwards. For quite a while, nobody tried even to touch on those interpretations. Nobody said peaceful unification the hope of peaceful unification has lost. There are some people, military people in China talk about that, but both Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao tried to downplay them until Xi Jinping came. Now he talked about we can no longer pass the unification issue from one generation to another generation. That means he has lost patience. Basically, he talked about these 2 other red lines. have to be reinforced. And they also, those are not in the law in Chinese law, but in the Chinese scholarly or official publications, they talk about Taiwan goes nuclear, foreign intervention, U.S. intervention, and also internal chaos in Taiwan. I think those are the 6 most important so-called red lines. And for Xi Jinping, I think he has been very clear on all those red lines. And he became more and more clear to reinterpret those red lines other than the Declaration of Independence. And also for timetable, Chinese side has denied there is a timetable. But I do see a timetable in a broader sense because Xi Jinping talked about China Dream, which has 2 centennial goals. One is 2021, one is 2049. In 19th Party's Congress report, he linked the complete national unification to the China Dream. In other words, in order to accomplish the second centennial objective of the China Dream, we have to complete the unification. So,
if a CEO of a corporation was on their quarterly earnings call and announced some transformational goal and said, we're going to complete it in 30 years, most people would hang up the phone call because they would understand that that's not, right? That's my cynical interpretation of Xi Jinping linking ultimate resolution of the Taiwan issue to national reunification is he set a goal that is sufficiently far away, but at a timetable people can understand, where it sort of signals we're moving in the right direction, we'll get there one day, just not anytime soon. So so it seems like you're interpreting, you think a timeline 3 decades away, though, is still an indication of new seriousness?
No, he has a long-term goal. That's the ultimate deadline here. But since his term will be 5 years, so he would have a contingency plan on this. At least from his mind, he has emphasized so much on the military modernization. He spent so much money on the military and emphasized so much on the military readiness for the war because the Chinese military is not ready yet. And so in that case, if there's a near-term red lines or timetables, that will depend on contingencies. What happened in the next 5 years? If, for example, 2024, if Taiwan's president elected who declares independence, he would use force. Doesn't matter if China is ready or not. If there is a U.S. president elected 2024, he declared Taiwan's independence, then China would have used the force. And as we said, he now talked about it cannot pass on one generation to another generation. He could use that at a time he thought he's ready. 2027, that's what people talked about.
Yeah.
The PLA become the most powerful in his mind, more than military force. Then he might use force. Another contingencies.
Do you think Xi Jinping is, so I assume you mean 2027 or if there was a crossing of a red line, or if Beijing felt like reunification was now becoming less and less
impossible to peacefully, yeah.
You think they would be prepared to launch I think an assault on the island?
Xi Jinping. That will also depend on many other factors, contingencies. For example, if China internally, Xi Jinping in big trouble in 5 years, domestically, he might use Taiwan as a force to rebuild his legitimacy and his popularity. I think a lot of people in China, I just don't understand. They are so anxious to see Taiwan be so-called reunified with China.
Yeah, on that, the question though is, it's one thing, it's one thing to have an aspiration that China successfully annexes Taiwan. I guess the real question though is this idea of Xi Jinping wagging the dog in 5 years or 10 years as a way to revive his legitimacy. That's a really risky gambit because that invasion has to go perfectly well. And I do wonder for Chinese nationalists who want to see Taiwan returned, in the abstract, I can understand that. The question really, though, is what price are you willing to pay? If you have body bags coming home, a war with Taiwan is happening just off of 3 of China's most prosperous populated provinces. It would be a real nightmare for China. So on that scenario of him reviving his legitimacy, it just feels like such a extraordinarily risky way to do it.
I would argue that if he launched the wall across Taiwan Strait, it will be the day the Communist Party rule is over.
That I agree with. Yeah.
So that's not very light decision for Xi Jinping.
Yeah. You think it'd be desperation?
Yeah, desperation. Yeah. It's a desperation. If a Communist Party legitimacy would be lost, so that might be one result or last result he could use, and he will use it. Definitely, he will use it. Disaster.
What do you think about especially in the wake of Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine? You and I could be having this discussion in early February, and we could be saying Putin's not going to invade. That would be that would be reckless. It would isolate Russia. And what we've subsequently learned is just how bad the decision-making process is in the Kremlin. Part of this is Freudian slip. Is Vladimir Putin surrounding himself with loyalists? He's getting reports about military preparedness, which were clearly not true. The Russian military overestimated its capabilities. They underestimated the abilities of the Ukrainian people. How much of that do you think should worry us about Xi Jinping and the decision-making, the quality of decision-making in Zhongnanhai, from now moving forward?
It's very bad. Two things here I think we should discuss. First thing I want to make sure we take Chinese warnings seriously, like Korean War, Vietnam War, all those things. China had the so-called ultimatum. Then
you mean their warnings on Taiwan, for example?
Yeah, we should take them seriously. Given that, when we said that, then we have to look at in detail what kind of decision-making process it is. Nowadays, it's so different from the Korean War period. As you said, Xi Jinping totally isolated himself in the bubble of making foreign policy and even domestic policy, COVID, zero policy. All these are very bad environment. I don't know how much Xi Jinping will get the real information, real world information these days. In the G20 summit, I was so kind of amused by one of his proposals. That is, China, in order to enhance international communication, international transportation, we want to share they call 健康码 health code with other countries.
Yeah.
When I heard that,
we'd all love that, wouldn't we?
Yeah. Nobody tells him. Only China in the whole world has that system. How can they share with other countries?
On that, though, do you, looking at the course correction on COVID policy over the last week in response to the protests, and I don't know if you saw the readout on the European side. A delegation from Brussels was just in Beijing, and they reported some of the informal comments that Xi Jinping said, one of which was he understood that the Chinese people were frustrated with COVID policy.
So that's a good example.
But does that make you, so it shows...
That's another example. It's not COVID policy. It's excessive COVID zero policy. It's not COVID itself. It seems he talked to those foreigners. He told them, oh, they are frustrated by COVID. It's not COVID. It's his policy. But he does not understand it. He does not get it.
But the course correction that Beijing has made over the last week does seem to show, although it took protests, it did show that they're not totally unresponsive to popular demand.
But they would not give up their COVID zero policy. They will not admit any mistakes. And they only quietly make adjustments. So they did not make mistakes. Their policy is still right.
No government admits mistakes, though, by the
Right.
way. You've been in America a very long time.
course.
You know that as well.
But
the real...
But here is either you change policy or you change policymakers. That's what we see in this country. But in China, they adjust policy. Then the policymakers will stay there to continue the policy in modified way. And so that, Xi Jinping always now emphasize one Chinese term, the self-correctness of the policy or mistakes, 自我纠错. In Chinese, I mean, he said that. That's totally ridiculous in the Chinese system. So you see the adjustments, but these adjustments, I don't know how far they can go. And also another point here on adjustments we see is that not well designed, not well prepared. Now we see so chaotic situation in China. The Chinese people still suffered. They canceled the test sites, but they still require the test results to enter those stalls. So it's totally chaotic.
We only have a few minutes left, and I want to try to apply the book and our discussion now to U.S.-China relations over the next several years. I mean, how do you think we should be dealing with Xi Jinping as a leader? You've done this in-depth study of, you know Xi very well, you know Chinese foreign policy making very well. What is your advice on how to best manage Xi Jinping, whether that's the U.S. government or the West more broadly?
I think communications, we have to assume he will still be in power for the next 5 years. We still have to deal with him. We have no choice in this case. If that's the case, we have to enhance communications to educate Xi Jinping to a certain extent. He really in his mind, he thought U.S. is declining power. And the U.S. has all those kind of problems. U.S. have made all those mistakes. He is doing all the things right. So that's totally misperception in his side. So the communications, all those channels to get information right is very important. In the meantime, the U.S. also should be prepared for the worst case scenarios because of those mind. He really thought U.S. is declining. Because of declining, U.S. would try to stop China from rising and undermine his regime. All these kind of things make him so confrontational. I think he's kind of in a split side. On one side, he said, "Oh, U.S. could be powerful," but U.S. also is in declining. So he's in a very confused situation.
It strikes me though that both Beijing and Washington are misassessing each other, because in Beijing, as you say, there's this view that U.S. is in terminal decline. In fairness, we did have a bunch of people storm into the U.S. Capitol. So there are, we are dealing with a lot of problems. And I can imagine the intelligence briefer writing a report for Xi Jinping. You can imagine the report that they're writing is looking at crime statistics, racial divisions. It's not clear if the next presidential, candidate will admit defeat and transfer power or accept an election. So we are dealing with problems. On this side, I see that, now, as you say, a year ago, China was heading straight for the moon. Now it's heading for straight down to collapse. And I noticed that I think we're overestimating the weakness in China.
Overreact.
So the reason I raise this is we're in an open society, and yet I feel like our information on China is not particularly good. So it seems that it's not just a problem of Xi Jinping's assessment. Our assessments, I think, are also slightly off base here. I mean, we always predict the collapse of China. I mean, you've been doing this, very long time. I've been hearing about the collapse of China for 30 years. So how do we get past that challenge of misperception on both sides?
Common sense.
In the wrong city, my friend.
Really? But I think common sense is very important. Such a big power, big country of China, and it has a totally different history. Those kind of, in my book, talk about the selective historical memory of the Chinese people, and we talk both resilience of democracy and resilience of authoritarianism, and also fragile of democracy and fragile of authoritarianism. Everything are there. So the issue here is that if you try to deal with a country, China sides, or deal with country, U.S. sides, you really have to look at not only day to day. I mean, when now China is talking, as you said, the Western countries are also very interesting. When the new leadership of 20th Congress came up, the stock market came down in Hong Kong, everywhere, so much. Then they said, oh, it's going to open up. You see the stock market came back so rapidly that you cannot make decisions or policy, long-term policy decisions dealing with China based upon those type of day-to-day fluctuation. China is going to climb, to climb, China would rise, or U.S. would decline, U.S. would renew, all those things. Both are true. So I think the common sense, just look through them to be persistent. We have to work with them. And what are the best interests of ours and theirs, and how we can match our interests, and how I think the current administration talk about what we can collaborate, what we have to compete, and what we have to fight for. I think those are issue by issue, case by case, and have a consistent policy, which I think in this time is very difficult. Consistency is the, shortage of.
Suisheng, we're basically at time, and I want to end on a relatively optimistic note. So I want to end on that last sentiment of yours. The book is The Dragon Roars Back: Transformational Leaders and Dynamics of Chinese Foreign Policy, Stanford University Press, out now. I think just a really essential book to read for anyone who's trying to understand where China's going, in part because you've done such a great, thorough job of looking at where China's foreign policy has come from, and as you rightly point out, how critical it is to understand leaders and their view of the world, their perceptions, and their assessment. So, Suisheng, thank you for joining us, and thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. Really, really great honor.
Thanks.